Hi, welcome to my video. I'm going to do a demo on how to make some bread. I'm going to do a flax bread. The reason I wanted to do a demo video is because there's some really important and specific techniques on how you knead and treat the dough that really helps in having your bread turn out well. And it's kind of hard to describe writing it in a recipe. So I'm going to show you how to do it and start from the beginning, and we'll just make a whole batch of bread. I'm going to make some of my favorite kind of bread, which is flax bread. So first I start with 1 3/4 cup of warm water, and I start with it on the warmer end, warmer than I want it to be when I add the yeast, but because I want to add the sugar and let it dissolve, and it'll cool a little bit during that process. So by the time we're ready for the yeast, it will be just the right temperature. And I'm adding 1/8 cup of sugar. I like to use raw sugar. You can also use honey. If you use honey, honey's a little sweeter than sugar. So if you're using honey, just use slightly less than the recipe calls for amount of sugar. So I just whisk it in and get it dissolved. And then the temperature that you want it to be for your yeast is just a nice warm temperature, something that when you put your finger in, it doesn't feel hot. You could keep your finger in there comfortably without it feeling too warm. So I'll just give it a feel, and it feels good. And then we're going to add 1 tablespoon of yeast. And I just use active dry yeast, regular kind. I don't like to use the quick rise yeast because I like enjoying the process of the yeast coming to life. So I just sprinkle the yeast over the water, 1 tablespoon, and then give it a quick little mix. And then we just let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes. It'll start bubbling, and then it's ready. So now we can see that the yeast is starting to activate. It just bubbles up to the surface like this. And we'll just wait for it to finish this, getting all bubbly and frothy, and then we'll move on to our next step. I love watching the yeast activate. So we're making flax bread, and to do that, you can buy bulk whole flax seed. You can also buy it ground, but it's cheaper to buy it whole and then just grind it yourself, and 2, it's fresher if you buy it whole and then grind it yourself. And to grind it, I just have it's a coffee grinder. It's the same as the one that I have to grind my coffee beans right there, but this one is just basically for flax. So this recipe calls for 1 cup of ground flax, and to get 1 cup of ground flax, you use 2/3 cup of whole flax, and by the time they grind up, it will be 1 cup in measurement. So I've already ground 1 cup, and just 1/3 cup, and put it in there. And then I will just grind my 2nd third, and then that will end up giving me a full cup. Just pour them carefully because they like to go all over the place. And it's also good to grind it because when they're whole, your body doesn't really digest them very well. So you grind them up so that you can get all the nutrients out of them. And there's now 1 cup of ground flax for our recipe. Okay, so as you can see, the yeast has now been activated. It's just nice and frothy sitting on the top of the water. So next we'll just give it a little stir, and then we're going to add the oil first. I like to use olive oil. You could use whatever oil you have or prefer, and you could also use melted butter or margarine. So we add 1 tablespoon of the oil. Give it a little mix in. And then the next step is adding the flour and the flax. So this is a flax and whole wheat bread, I use mostly flax and whole wheat flour, and I like to include just 1 cup of white flour just to make the bread a little lighter. You can omit the cup of white flour if you want and just make it all whole wheat and flax if you like. But from experimenting with this recipe, I really like the results of that just adding this 1 cup of white flour gives. So just sprinkle it in and mix it in, and when you're making the bread, always just add 1 cup of flour at a time so you can really get the flour incorporated well and that you can really get a sense of how the dough's doing and how much flour it needs. So you want to mix this in until there's no lumps. And the thing about making the flax bread is the ground flax doesn't have gluten in it, and it doesn't have any kind of property in it that makes the bread rise like flour does. So what we do in this recipe to compensate for that is add some baking powder, and the measurement for it is for every 1 cup of whatever it is, whether it's ground flaxseed or maybe you're using a rice flour or you want to do some quinoa flour, any kind of flour that doesn't have gluten in it or doesn't rise, add 2.5 teaspoons of baking powder for every cup of whatever that is. So I'm going to add my 1 cup of flax, and then I'll add 2.5 teaspoons of baking powder to help with its rising. Two and a half teaspoons of baking powder, and at the same time I like to add the salt. I like to add the salt once some of the flour and flax has been already added, because when I was having troubles with making bread when I first started and I was reading troubleshooting about it, and I read somewhere that salt can deactivate your yeast if you add too much too fast. So I like to wait until there's some other things in there, some flour and some flax, before I add it. Stir that in. And now the reason that I like to add the flax and the white flour first is because it's just 1 cup of those each, and I don't have to keep track of them. They're added, and now all I'm adding is the whole wheat flour until the dough is at a point where it's ready. Mix in really good. You want to make sure that that baking powder and the salt is nice and evenly distributed throughout your dough. And then we'll start adding the whole wheat flour, 1 cup at a time. So after about this cup, this is kind of the last time that it's going to be easy to mix, and then it's going to kind of start getting thicker and getting harder to mix. And one thing about when you're making bread that I had trouble with in the beginning was I always wanted to, like, say the recipe calls for 5 cups of flour. I always tried to get all those 5 cups in at this point when I'm mixing it in the bowl. But you actually add about a cup or 2 of flour once you've dumped it onto the counter and are kneading it, because you need to have flour on the counter. You need to flour your hands a lot to keep it from sticking. And so whatever the recipe calls for in flour, expect that you're not going to add all of that while it's in the bowl, that you're going to save a cup or 2 of that, and that's going to get kneaded in. At this point, it's you kind of have to just press instead of stir to try and get it in, press and fold. And this is about it. After this, I'm going to add the rest on the counter when I knead. I stirred in that last cup of flour. That was the 2nd cup of whole wheat flour. and the recipe calls for 4. So we've still got about 1 or 2 more to go. Also, don't try and be exactly strict about how much flour you use. It's not so much about what the recipe says, it's about how the dough is looking and feeling, because it can depend on humidity in the air, etc. So then you just want to take some flour, sprinkle it on the counter. I like to dump some of the rest right here. This is what I'm going to be flouring my hands with, and you want to keep your hands really well floured. Flour them really frequently so that the dough doesn't stick. Okay, so then right now the dough is still really sticky. I'm just going to dump it out onto the counter. A little flour on my hand to try and get this off. Okay, then at this point I like to just drop my bowl in the sink and get it soaking in some hot water so that when I'm ready to put the dough back in the bowl to rise, it's cleaned and ready. I'm just going to do that quick. Okay, so now we're ready to start kneading. So just grab some flour, let's get a bunch on your hands. I like to start by just pressing the dough down, more flour, press it and fold it over itself. Start pressing and folding it in half and really flouring your hands frequently, folding and pressing. Making sure it stays floured underneath. And then after not too long, you'll find that it's not quite as sticky. You don't need to flour quite as much. You're still going to feel a little stickiness on your hands, but as long as it's not completely sticking to your hand, you're okay. Just be careful with how much flour you add, because you want to keep your dough from being too heavy from too much flour. And you just knead it for about 5 minutes. You also want to be careful not to over knead it. You just want to keep working it until it comes into a nice soft ball. So that's the basic kneading technique. And then once it starts, you feel it starts to come into a bit of a ball, and then you can kind of roll it like this a little bit, fold it over, roll it some more like that, and really start to build the elasticity in the dough. Using less flour now than you were at the beginning. And now it's starting to feel really pliable, and it's pretty much done. So you see it's kind of a sticky dough like this. You press it and it leaves a little indent and it starts to pop up again. It's ready. I'll just get my bowl and we'll do the next step. So the next step is we're gonna put a little bit of oil in the bowl so that the dough doesn't stick to it as it rises. Just a really little drop. I use a pastry brush. You could use your fingers if you want to. Spread it around the bottom, along the sides. I like to start with just a really little bit and then add more if I need it, so that we're not using too much. Going around the sides, all the way up to the top, because your dough is going to rise really high. So one thing that I found when I started making bread was I really enjoyed the process of kneading. It was really fun and I liked the feel of it. But because I liked it so much, I was doing it too much and too long. So you'll notice that was a pretty short knead that I did there just now. But that's all it takes, is until it's come together into this ball. Okay, and then we drop the dough in the bowl, give it a little swirl to get the bottom oiled up, and then a little more oil. I like to just do this on my hands and just kind of pat it. Pat the top and the sides, just a really little amount, but just to keep it moist for when it's rising. Okay, and then we just cover it with a tea towel, like this, and put it somewhere warm to rise. The best places to put it are on top of the fridge or inside of the oven with the light on. So I like to do mine in the oven. Pop it in there, turn the light on, and that's going to take half hour, 45 minutes for it to rise. Keep an eye on it. You don't want it to rise too much. You just want to wait until it's risen about double in size. For this, it will be up to the top of the bowl. And then we'll do our next step when it's ready. This is the dough after its first rise. It's about doubled in size. It's a lot lighter now. And this is the technique that I really wanted to show you, because in most bread recipes, they tell you at this point to punch down the dough and re-knead it. And what I found is that really just gets rid of all the air that's in the dough that helps it rise and be nice and light. And so I came across this technique, which is called folding the dough. And basically you handle it as little as possible. You just want to move it around a little bit so the yeast is exposed to new food. It's kind of like the yeast has eaten all the food that's around it right now, and we just want to give it access to something new. So what you do is you just get your fingers under the side, grab it from underneath, and stretch it out like this. Flip it around, let it fall, and then fold it over in half. And do that again. Stretch it out again. Let it use its own weight to just droop down. Stretch it out like that. Using your fingers, go along the edge, move it around. There. Once it's stretched out like that, that's it. Now we'll let it rise a second time. You can skip the second rise if you want. I find it really helps develop the flavor of the bread. So cover it up, put it back for another 30-45 minute rise. Okay, so now we have the dough after its second rise, and we're going to shape it now into loaves. So we start out the same way, doing a bit of a stretch of it. You just want to stretch it out so it's kind of long and thinned out, like that. Take just a really little bit of oil and kind of rub your counter a little bit, because you don't want the dough to stick to it as we shape the loaves. Just a little bit like that. Okay, so what you want to do is start rolling it, tucking the ends under and pulling it towards yourself gently so that you're making this part here stretch tightly over itself. Kind of work from side to side a little bit to try and keep the loaf uniform shape from one end to the other, like that. Okay. And once it's like this, you want to tuck the ends under. So what you do, just grab it, use your fingers to push it in on itself, and use your palms to kind of stretch the top tight. And just kind of use little movements until it's tucked under and looks smooth and kind of like the center of the loaf does. And flip it around and do the same with the other side. So you're pushing this in, basically, and using your palms to gently stretch it. And you want to pull the top tight because that helps it rise nicely. And you want to handle it as little as possible. So there, that's looking pretty good. Just even up this side a little bit. And that's it. Then you take your pan and you spray it with Pam, or you coat it with oil, whichever you like. Pam works a little better for really keeping it from sticking at all. But if you don't like Pam, or you don't have Pam and you have oil, you can use oil. Just give it a spray. Or brush it with the oil if you're using that. And then just gently lift this, trying to not take it out of its shape. Pop it in the loaf pan. Usually just give it a little jiggle and it makes sure that it tucks in nicely. Then we'll cover it and let it rise a final time. When it's ready to go in the oven is when it is risen to just a little above the top of the pan. You don't want to let it rise too high, or it could fall in and cave in on itself when it's in the oven, and then you have a sunken loaf. So just let it rise until it's just got the nice little curve over the top of the pan, and then it's ready to go in the oven. It'll take another half hour, 45 minutes to rise in this stage. Okay, so the bread's out of the oven. We baked it at, so first I preheated the oven to 400 degrees while it was rising in the pan. And then as soon as I put it in the oven, I turned the temperature down to 375. And then that baked for about 35 or 40 minutes. And then I took it out and let it cool in the pan for about 5 minutes. And then you just take a butter knife and run it along the sides. And you're going to take it out and put it on a rack to cool. And there it is. Some delicious flax bread.